On the outside, it would have looked like a very ordinary glass. A dark drink, a little fizz, a little coldness gathering on the surface, a marble counter beneath it, a pharmacist nearby, tidy as a minister, and nearly as trusted, a few customers leaning in with polite curiosity, a warm afternoon settling over Atlanta. Nothing in the scene would have announced to you that you were standing in the middle of one of the strangest little loopholes in American history. And that perhaps is the best way to begin, because the original Coca-Cola did not arrive in the world looking like scandal. It arrived looking respectable. It arrived as a tonic, a stimulant, a modern pick-me-up poured in a room associated with medicine, order, and public trust. It arrived where the labels were neat, the shelves were straight, the syrup bottles glowed in the light, and the language around every drink was clean enough to satisfy the conscience, even when the chemistry was a little harder to explain honestly. So tonight, we are going to move slowly into that room. We are going to walk into an America that trusted tonics more than water, an America still tired from war and eager for anything that felt like progress in a glass. We are going to meet the aching pharmacist who helped create the drink, the social world of the drugstore, the mysterious leaves and bitter nuts that gave the formula its first strange pulse, the soda fountain that made medicine taste like pleasure, and the temperance-minded culture that accidentally helped turn a pharmacy tonic into one of the most famous drinks on earth. And because this is a story for sleep, we are not going to chase the loudest version of it. We are not going to yank every strange fact into the foreground and shake it until it startles you awake. We are going to let the story breathe. We are going to let the bottles stand quietly on their shelves. We are going to let the fizz rise slowly in the glass. We are going to let the old city of Atlanta gather around us in gaslight and dusk and dust and syrup and paper labels and cooling marble. For now, the room is still. The counter is smooth. The brass taps are catching the last of the afternoon light. Somewhere outside, wheels pass over the street. Somewhere inside, a spoon touches glass, and the glass, though it should look more suspicious than it does, sits there looking almost innocent. Let us go back. You wake in an America that is trying very hard to feel modern, and not always succeeding. The bed is uneven, the morning air a little too thin, and the day begins with the familiar question of what one is supposed to put into the body in order to make the rest of life bearable. The decade is the 1880s. The Civil War is over, but its aftershocks are still in people's bodies, in their finances, in their politics, and in the general American habit of pretending that recovery is just around the corner, as long as nobody looks too closely at the damage. Cities are growing. Rail lines are stretching. Advertisements are getting louder. Invention is in the air. So is anxiety. And the simplest problem of all, thirst, has become more complicated than it ought to be. Water exists, of course. Wells, pumps, pipes where pipes can be had. Pitchers, troughs, cups dipped from barrels, all the usual arrangements of ordinary life. But trust in water is another matter entirely. The wrong source can mean sickness. The wrong pipe can mean filth. The wrong street, the wrong well, the wrong season. And what ought to be the plainest comfort in the world begins to feel like a wager made in poor light. Cholera is not an abstract word. Typhoid is not just a chapter heading. People learn caution by rumor, by memory, by the stories of neighbors, by the old and persistent understanding that clear does not always mean safe. Coffee is an answer for some, but not always a sufficient one. It can be expensive, bitter, badly roasted, or simply not enough to satisfy a culture that is increasingly interested in sharper, faster, more modern forms of wakefulness. Tea is pleasant, but not always thrilling. Beer carries its own moral baggage. Whiskey has become the subject of sermons and civic hand-wringing. And so, into the ordinary gap between bodily need and social permission, America pours a great shining river of patent medicine. Bottles crowd the shop windows, tonic wines, nerve restorers, invigorating elixirs, cough syrups, sleeping draughts, female regulators, digestives, blood purifiers, bitters, liver revivers, anti-melancholy drops, soothing compounds and cures for complaints so vaguely named that they seem to apply to being alive in general. The labels are elaborate and persuasive. The ingredients are less forthcoming. Sugar helps, alcohol helps, opium helps, depending on the complaint and the conscience of the seller. Cocaine, where it appears, helps in its own brisk way. Peppermint and cinnamon and citrus and vanilla do their best to make the whole arrangement feel like civilization rather than improvisation. This is one of the first truths the original Coca-Cola story needs us to understand. The country did not wait in a state of sobriety and innocence for Coca-Cola to arrive and tempt it into chemical foolishness. The country was already halfway there, perhaps more than halfway. It already wanted relief in a bottle. It already knew the drugstore as a place where the body's inconveniences could be negotiated, sweetened, soothed, corrected, or at least delayed. It already trusted the strange authority of a white coat, fancy label, and a phrase such as restorative, invigorating, or for the nerves. If you step into a drugstore on an ordinary morning, you can feel the logic of the place immediately. The bell on the door rings softly. Shelves line the walls. Glass catches the light. The floorboards are worn. There is a candy jar. There are brushes and soaps and powders and little folded packets. There is the smell of camphor and licorice and paper and wood polish and whatever sweet syrup was poured last. A woman asks for something to ease a cough. A clerk wants relief from a headache. A mother wants something for a restless child. A laborer wants enough energy to get through a long afternoon. Everyone frames the request differently. The requests all bend toward the same human wish. Make this day more manageable. That wish is older than Coca-Cola. And it is the reason Coca-Cola will be able to look less like a scandal and more like an answer. But before there is a famous answer, there is a man with pain in his own body and hope in a cluttered room. John Pemberton is not, at first, a myth. He is a veteran, a pharmacist, a businessman, a striver, and a man marked by a wound that did not politely leave once the battle did. The war had introduced him, as it introduced many others, to morphine. Morphine had offered relief. Relief had become dependence. Dependence had turned the body's suffering into a slower, quieter kind of trap. Oh, it is too easy to tell the story afterward, as though Pemberton were merely tinkering in pursuit of profit. Profit mattered, of course, but there was ache here too, and that ache belongs in the room with every bottle and spoon. Imagine him in the back of the pharmacy, or in a workroom that is part laboratory, part storeroom, part hope chaos. Shelves are crowded with jars and tins, leaves dry in packets, powders wait in folded papers, a ledger lies open. A notebook contains recipes, revisions, half-promising failures, and the residue of a restless mind refusing to give up. Some bottles are labeled neatly. Others are labeled in the sort of handwriting that assumes the writer will be the only person foolish enough to use them. A pestle rests in a mortar. A kettle or pan holds syrup in some early stage. The light is worn, not because the room is luxurious, but because the century has to make do with lamps and afternoon sun, where it can find them. Pemberton moves through this world with the concentration of someone who is not merely pursuing novelty, but trying to outwit pain. That is important. Coca-Cola does not begin as simple frivolity. It begins in a culture that calls stimulants by respectable names, and in a room where the body's discomfort is being treated as a problem chemistry might solve. Pemberton had every reason to think along those lines. Many others did too. Patent medicines sold briskly because they met the emotional needs of their customers. A wounded pharmacist trying to devise a better tonic was not an exception. He was an especially driven version of a national habit. On the work table lies some of the ingredients that will shape the future of the drink, though no one in the room yet knows how long that future will stretch. There are coca leaves, imported from South America, carrying with them a long history the American drug trade only partly understands and very eagerly commodifies. There are cola or cola nuts from West Africa, hard, bitter, rich with caffeine, and already valued in the cultures from which they come. There is sugar, inevitable and heavy with commercial promise. There are oils, flavorings, acids, and all the little adjustments by which a tonic moves from medicinal severity towards something the public will not merely tolerate, but crave. The chemistry is not simple, and the philosophy beneath it is simpler than the chemistry. If a drink can stimulate, soothe, refresh, relieve, and taste pleasant enough for repeated use, then one has not merely made a medicine. One has made a habit. This is where the room grows very quiet. Leaves are crushed, syrup is stirred, notes are made, a spoon is lifted and set down. The smell in the room shifts from bitterness to something darker and sweeter as sugar meets plant extracts, and the whole experiment inches toward palatability. One can imagine the way 19th century pharmacy required patience without necessarily requiring precision in the modern sense. A little more of this, a little less of that. Try the next batch, taste again, adjust. Not always scientific in the strictest modern definition, but certainly not random either. It is disciplined hope, and because this story belongs to history for sleep, let us linger here a little longer. The workroom is warm, the jars are still, the leaves make a soft, dry sound when touched. Outside, wheels pass over the street and then fade. The room contains the future, in a thick, dark syrup that does not yet know its own name as legend. There is a tenderness in that moment. The drink is not famous. It is not ubiquitous. It is not yet a national symbol or an international shorthand. It is only possibility held in glass then. As with so many inventions, possibility needs a stage. The stage is the pharmacy, more specifically, the late 19th century American drugstore with its peculiar double identity. It is a medical place, certainly, but it is also a civic one. It sells remedies and gossip in almost equal proportion. It gives out powders and social standing. It offers stools, counters, conversation, and the sense that one can go there without shame, even when what one really wants is not cure but comfort. If the saloon is morally troublesome, and the home can be lonely, the pharmacy stands in between. It is clean enough for families, lively enough for the bored, respectable enough for the temperate, and chemically adventurous enough for anyone who is quietly tired of feeling ordinary. Step into it now. The bell on the door rings. The marble counter is cool under the hand. The soda fountain gleams like a machine from a more hopeful future. Brass taps, polished handles, glass bottles with rich-colored syrups in them, a little arrangement of order and performance. The pharmacist, or perhaps a young soda jerk under, his watch, stands ready not only to dispense but to perform. Every drink is a miniature ceremony, glass taken down, syrup poured, carbonated water released with a hiss that sounds both clean and thrilling, a spoon turning briefly, foam rising, the glass handed over. This environment matters almost as much as the drink itself. Coca-Cola did not rise in a hidden den. It rose in full view, in a place associated with public trust. That is why the phrase, respectable stimulation, is so useful. It names the strange moral laundering that the drugstore could perform. A drink did not have to call itself intoxicating. It only had to call itself invigorating. A customer did not have to say, "I would like a legal little thrill, thank you." He could say he was run down. She could say the nerves had been troublesome. A parent could say the child seemed listless. The language remained neat, and neat language can carry almost any chemistry for a while. Around the fountain, the room fills with people living different versions of the same fatigue. A clerk wanting an afternoon lift, a woman resting her shopping basket by the bench, a traveling salesman delaying the road a little longer, a young man lingering where a young woman has also chosen to linger, a preacher pretending he is only interested in the weather, children hoping for sweetness, older people hoping for relief, and not minding sweetness at all. The soda fountain does not discriminate much. It offers one of the few public rituals in which pleasure, medicine, and sociability are poured from the same apparatus. Now imagine the first dark glass of Coca-Cola taking its place here. Syrup first, then water, charged and cold and quick with bubbles. The hiss is immediate. The spoon catches the light. The foam rises. There is a smell of citrus and spice and caramel, and something less easily named beneath them, some sharper nerve under the sweetness. The glass is slid over the marble. The customer drinks. The first impression is not danger. The first impression is surprise, because this does not taste like punishment. It does not taste like the sort of medicine that requires courage. It tastes good, sweet, cold, vivid, a little tingle at the edges of the tongue, a feeling of sharpened possibility. If the culture of patent remedies trained Americans to hope for effect, Coca-Cola taught them that effect could come dressed as delight. That changed the scale of the game. A room can become attached to a flavor very quickly when the flavor arrives with a little brightness in the body. Conversations lift. A tired face becomes more alert. Someone asks for another glass. Someone else wants to know the name. A child asks whether it can be had again tomorrow. The pharmacist keeps his composure, because composure is part of the illusion. But inwardly, one can imagine the calculations already beginning. This is not merely another tonic. This is something people may want before they decide they need it. That is a very different sort of product, and because America in these years is already a country of patent medical hope, the drink does not land in empty cultural space. Look again at the shelves around the room. Every label claims a better version of ordinary life. Every bottle suggests that fatigue, sadness, pain, weight, nerves, dullness, poor digestion, bad sleep, or low spirits can be corrected by the proper purchase. Coca-Cola enters that chorus not as the only voice, but as a particularly melodic one. It promises what others promise, but more gracefully. It offers cure language and pleasure together. It lets the country keep its old appetite for miracle tonics, while advancing the style in which they are enjoyed. That wider patent medicine world deserves its own gentle walk, because it is one of the reasons the early Coke story becomes so bizarre only when viewed from a great distance. Picture a street lined with signs: Professor somebody's invigorating cordial, Mrs. somebody's soothing syrup, a bottle for the lungs, a tonic for feminine weakness, a wine for the blood, tablets for melancholia, a little powder for children who cry too much, a restorative bitters for men whose work has made them thin or dull or short-tempered. The language is confident because confidence sells. The ingredients are less loudly advertised because mystery sells too. Nobody yet lives under the sort of federal labeling system that would later make such exuberant opacity more difficult. In such a world, cocaine does not arrive wearing modern criminal associations. It arrives through medicine, dentistry, tonics, wine, and a halo of scientific curiosity. It can be prescribed, it can be praised, it can be discussed in articles, and among physicians with the slightly dazzled tone that societies often use when a new substance seems to offer sharpness, vigor, or relief. Some people worry naturally, but worry lags behind excitement when the effects feel useful and the institutions involved look dignified. This is why one can say, without exaggerating too much, that the true scandal is how normal it all seemed. A mother might possess a medicinal syrup containing ingredients no modern parent would permit near a nursery. A dentist might use cocaine for numbing. A physician might recommend it for a range of complaints so broad that the complaint begins to resemble the human condition itself. A pharmacist might mix it into something respectable enough to hand over in daylight. Under those conditions, Coca-Cola is not yet a shocking anomaly. It is an especially successful citizen of a strange republic. The room is quiet again. The shelves stand in order. The labels are ornate. The glass is only half empty. Nobody in the room is using the word dangerous. They are using words like invigorating and restorative, and for the nerves. They are using the language that turns appetite into treatment and stimulation, into civic propriety, and motivação. This is exactly where marketing steps in and makes the arrangement even more durable. The advertisements for Coca-Cola did more than announce a drink. They interpreted it for the public. They told people how to think about it. They gave the drink a moral costume. It was not merely refreshing. It was intelligent, not merely stimulating. It was wholesome in the right setting, not merely modern. It was practically civic-minded. One could read those ads and feel not that one was reaching for a risky enthusiasm, but that one was adopting an enlightened little aid to modern life. The wording mattered, the setting mattered, the tone mattered. A drink can change its meaning, depending on whether it is poured under a pharmacy lamp or in a saloon back room, whether it is offered by a pharmacist in a white coat or a bartender in shirt sleeves, whether it is advertised as a brain tonic or an indulgence. Coca-Cola's early genius was to understand instinctively that the same chemical effect, framed differently, could travel through the culture with much less resistance. Nowhere was that truer than in the age of temperance. America, in the late 19th century, was arguing loudly with alcohol. Ministers denounced it. Reformers marched against it. Women's groups connected it to waste, violence, and domestic misery. Moral seriousness gathered around the cause of sobriety. Respectable society increasingly wanted a public beverage that did not carry whiskey's smell or beer's political burden. The saloon was suspect. The pharmacy was not. And so, with a sort of accidental brilliance, Coca-Cola stepped into the opening created by temperance culture and said, very softly, "Here's your alternative. A bubbly drink, a little thrill, a sense of brightness, a public ritual, a clean counter, a child-safe room, a preacher-approved surface. Parents could permit it, pastors could tolerate it, clerks could drink it at noon, teachers could be seen near it, ladies could take a glass without crossing any obvious line. The whole nation wanted a loophole, and the soda fountain had one waiting. This is the hidden viral engine in the story. Temperance did not simply fight vice. It redirected thirst. Picture a Sunday afternoon. The sermon has warned against strong drink. The day is hot. People are restless beneath their layers of proper clothing. Outside the church, families gather, hats tilted against the light. Children beginning to squirm. Adults beginning to think of what refreshment can still be enjoyed without moral compromise. Later, in the pharmacy or at the soda fountain, the glasses are poured. The room stays polite. The stimulation stays inside acceptable language. Nobody staggers. Nobody shouts. Yet the lift is still there. A brightening of the eyes. A quickening of conversation. A subtle and socially permissible buzz moving under clean manners. The more loudly the culture denounced saloon excess, the more attractive the drugstore alternative could seem. And because this is still America, the moment one town decides it lacks such a loophole, the rest of the country begins preparing to imitate it. Atlanta helps. Atlanta in the 1880s is ambitious, rebuilding, noisy, dusty, hungry, and not yet burdened with excessive regulatory hesitation. It is exactly the kind of city in which a drink can move from experiment to sensation without too many people asking whether such velocity is itself suspicious. Walk the streets mentally, and you can feel the hustle. Carriages, rails, new business signs, warehouses, print shops. Heat in summer, mud in rain, men selling, men borrowing, men boasting, women keeping households steady, while the city reinvents itself around them. A place where novelty is not just entertained, but courted. In such a city, Coca-Cola is not merely a drink, it is an emblem of being up to date. A glass at the right counter says, You know where the future is appearing. A bottle in the house says your family participates in the modern mood. A sign in the window says, a business understands public desire. Atlanta, like many rising American cities, had a weakness for invention and presentation in equal measure. If something could be sold as health, progress, and refreshment all at once, the city was inclined to give it a chance. And the chance became habit because doctors and pharmacists kept helping it along. A physician's recommendation could settle a customer's conscience with startling efficiency. If the body felt weak, if the nerves were frayed, if the digestion lagged, if the spirits had gone dull, a glass of Coca-Cola could be framed, not as pleasure but as sensible assistance. Once medicine endorsed the ritual, the public could sink more comfortably into repetition. One no longer had to choose between indulgence and virtue. The same glass could serve both. Imagine now the doctor's office in late afternoon, a patient in a chair, a complaint vague enough to be common and real at the same time. Fatigue, nervousness, headache, no appetite, too much appetite, general low spirits. The doctor listens, nods, perhaps not with full understanding of the underlying life, but with confidence in the tools of the age. He writes, or he recommends, the patient leaves with an instruction that feels almost lucky. Drink this. It will do you good. Back at the drugstore. The pharmacist reads the note, prepares the glass, and passes it over. No mystery to the room, no criminality in the exchange. If anything, the act has acquired more dignity than before. That is how institutions can dignify appetite. They need only frame it as treatment. But institutions alone do not build an empire. Portability does. When Coca-Cola begins to escape the fountain in bottles, the rhythm of its history changes. Fountain is a place. A bottle is a system. The early bottling world is not elegant in the clean modern sense. It is fragile, noisy, laborious, and prone to accidents that leave floors sticky and tempers tested. Glass is expensive and temperamental. Corks misbehave. Carbonation strains against confinement. Heat does unhelpful things. Wagons jolt. Crates split. Labels peel. Syrup can vary. Water has to be managed. Workers are not always as careful as the future would prefer to remember them. Yet even in such chaos, the bottle carries enormous promise because it liberates the drink from the counter. Now Coca-Cola can travel. It can go to Porches, depots, baseball grounds, picnics, train journeys, family tables, work breaks, and hot afternoons far from any fountain. A local ritual turns into a portable habit. That shift is harder to overstate than it first appears. The social meaning changes once a drink can leave the room that legitimized it. At the same time, the very familiarity of the bottle begins to wash away the drink's stranger origins. People do not think as carefully about chemistry when the object in hand feels domestic. Listen to the bottling room for a moment. Glass clinks in crates. Syrup moves through larger vessels now. Workers cap, wipe, stack, lift. A foreman worries about breakage and timing. Someone tastes a batch. Someone complains about heat. Someone jokes that the crates sound like little bells when moved carefully. The whole operation has more industrial music than the quiet pharmacy ever did. Yet it retains the same underlying ambition, to put brightness into a container and send it outward. By the time the bottle reaches the porch or picnic blanket, much of the old pharmacy atmosphere has dissolved. There may be children nearby now. There may be grandparents. There may be a Sunday meal. There may be workmen resting in shade. There may be sweet tea, pie, folded newspapers, and a bottle opening with a quick small pop that sounds cheerful and complete. That pop is one of the sounds of a product becoming domestic, and with domestication comes another stage of forgetting. A family may not think of the original medicinal context every time a bottle is opened. They may think instead of refreshment, hospitality, summer, company, reward. The drugstore origin remains in the background. The pleasure moves forward. That is what successful consumer culture does to origins. It polishes them, until only a stylized ancestry remains. Yet consequences, where they exist, do not vanish simply because branding improves. The sweetness remains sweet, but it leaves its little marks. Tender teeth, dry mouth, sleeplessness after too much, a kind of persistent alertness that can feel productive at noon and inconvenient in the dark. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes the cost of a new national habit arrives as a dentist's busier schedule, and 1,000 small jokes about aching molars. Sometimes it arrives in the body's refusal to become quiet at night, after the day has been sharpened too often. The 19th century was not especially gifted at tracing long-term side effects before the side effects became impossible to ignore. That is another reason the early history feels so strange now. People were not stupid, only limited by the habits and knowledge of their own time, by the seductions of taste, by the authority of medical language, and by the very ordinary human desire to preserve what feels good until it becomes undeniably costly. Imagine the dentist's chair now, not a place of modern comfort, a place of hardness, instruments, metal, and the profound wish to be anywhere else. The mouth that has known so much sweetness pays for some of its joy in this room. The body learns that progress can leave behind aches. It is an old lesson. Every century learns a version of it. Still, the bottles keep moving. The advertisements keep printing. The country keeps choosing the drink because alternatives exist, and most of them are worse. This is where rivalry becomes useful to the story. Coca-Cola was not alone in the late 19th century marketplace of optimistic beverages. There were other tonics, other nerve foods, other colas, other syrups with medical ambitions and large claims. Some were too bitter, some were too odd, some tasted medicinal in the old punishing way, some were merely forgettable. A few came close enough to be taken seriously. But the genius of Coca-Cola, once again, was not that it alone promised effect. It was that it made the effect enjoyable enough to repeat. One can wander mentally through a shelf of competing drinks and feel the difference immediately. One bottle suggests improvement. Another suggests endurance. Another says it will restore vigor. Another swears by brain power, blood purity, digestion, calm, or cheerful spirits. Yet when the glass is finally poured, too many of them still taste like duty. Coca-Cola, by contrast, had learned a more dangerous lesson. Make the body want the remedy before the mind has finished calling it one. That is how a regional fashion edges toward national myth. News travels, posters travel, bottles travel, stories travel, even faster than the bottles do. There is a drink in Atlanta. There is a drink in this town. There is a drink that makes people feel better. There is a drink sold in pharmacies. There is a drink your cousin tried. There is a drink your clerk wants in the shop. There is a drink your preacher pretends not to like as much as he plainly does. Stories breed appetite. Appetite breeds distribution. Distribution breeds familiarity. Familiarity breeds the dangerous human conclusion that whatever is common must have made its peace with risk. By now, if you sit in the drugstore late enough, you can hear the country changing itself glass by glass. A salesman talks about a shipment. Another asks for a bottle to take home. A young man says the fountain in the next town has begun serving it too. An older customer insists the original formula had more life in it than the newer batch. A pharmacist keeps a careful face while doing prosperous arithmetic in his head. The room remains orderly, the glasses remain cool, but the boundaries between medicine, habit, and commerce have grown thin enough to see through. That is usually the moment when scrutiny finally arrives. The same qualities that made Coca-Cola thrive begin to draw more questioning attention. Ingredients matter more now. Public health reform is growing sharper. Newspapers are better at turning suspicion into headlines. The broad American confidence in miracle substances starts to fray at the edges as stories accumulate, and the century edges toward a different relationship with food. Drugs, regulation, and public trust. What had once been spoken of with admiration can begin quietly to be spoken of with caution. You can picture the shift in the language first. a little too stimulating, a bit much for children, not ideal before bed, strong for the nerves, better in moderation. Then come the more direct concerns. Is there cocaine in this drink? Is it wise to sell such a product so freely? What exactly have the nation's favorite tonics been doing to the national body? A scandal does not always arrive as a shout. Sometimes it arrives as a correction in tone, in parlors and porches and pharmacy corners. Stories circulate. A relative who felt the heart racing, someone who could not sleep after too many glasses, someone who became too fond of the daily ritual, a child too bright, too restless, too eager for another serving. Ministers who once praised the temperance-friendly alternative begin to sound less sure. Doctors who once recommended stimulation more freely begin to temper their enthusiasm. The culture turns, as cultures often do, not all at once, but in little adjustments of voice. The company faces an awkward problem. How does one preserve the ritual while changing the chemistry? How does one remove what the future will condemn without breaking what the public already loves? How does one talk slowly enough that the drink's old confidence can survive the new caution? This is where the story becomes especially American in its managerial grace. The answer is not a grand confession. It is transition, quiet reform, decoconized coca leaves, formula evolution, public messaging steady enough to keep the bottle familiar. Business continuing, because business must continue. There is something almost eerie in how softly such changes can occur once a product has become part of daily life. The label need not scream. The fountain need not fall silent. The bottle need not announce its own edited ancestry. It only needs to remain recognizably itself while the chemists and managers and lawyers make sure that the new era can be entered without drawing too much direct attention to the old one. Imagine the back room again, but now later in the story. Not the hopeful improvisation of the original Respectable, but the more guarded labor of maintenance and adjustment. Men discussing taste, men worrying about consistency, men thinking about headlines, regulations, public comfort, and the strange task of preserving the soul of a drink while replacing one of its once central cultural thrills. There are notebooks again, measurements again. The old ambition has changed shape. It is no longer invention. It is preservation. Most customers do not experience that backstage strain directly. They experience continuity, a familiar bottle, a familiar taste, close enough, a familiar ritual, a familiar lift, though perhaps now a different sort of one. The dangerous brilliance of consumer habit is that it asks relatively little historical memory from the person lifting the glass. If the object still feels like itself, the public may permit many quiet substitutions, and so Coca-Cola survives its own most awkward correction by becoming, more thoroughly than ever, an everyday object. But everydayness is the final veil once a product belongs to the home. The lunch break, the family outing, the picnic, the roadside stop, the baseball game, the workday pause, and the little daily reward. It gathers layers of innocence. Even if the past remains buried inside it, the present keeps pouring itself over the old story until the old story sounds implausible, almost decorative, like something one hears in a trivia book or a late-night anecdote, and then half forgets again. But tonight we are not forgetting it. Tonight we are letting the old world stay visible a little longer. The gaslight in the pharmacy, the sound of the spoon in the glass, the sugar darkening the medicinal edge, the city of Atlanta, young and ambitious and underregulated, the wounded pharmacist making possibility out of pain, the soda fountain as a loophole in a temperance age, the doctors who lent authority, the bottles in crates, the children asking for another one, the dentists growing busier, the whisper of concern, the quiet reform, the bottle going on, as famous things so often do, by learning how to outlast the language that once explained them. There is another way to understand the spread of Coca-Cola, and it is to follow not the company first, but the rooms. One room is the pharmacy itself in the middle of a long afternoon. The door opens and closes often enough to make the bell sound like part of the building's breathing. A woman enters with a child and asks, with some embarrassment, whether there is anything gentle for a lingering cough. A factory clerk comes in and says very little, only that his head has been bad all morning, and there is still half a day of ledgers left before he can go home. A traveling salesman appears as if blown in by the rail line itself, hat dusty collar soft with use, eager for whatever can make a town he has never seen before feel a little less like exile. On the bench, two elderly men discuss weather, politics, and the comparative merits of one nerve. Tonic over another, with the settled seriousness of people who have turned bodily complaint into a civic pastime. The pharmacist listens to all of it while continuing the small choreography of the counter. A bottle opened, a measure poured, a spoon dipped, a little envelope folded, a powder wrapped in paper, a recommendation spoken in the calm voice of someone who is expected to know more than anyone could reasonably know about the body. The drugstore is not only a place of commerce, it is a place where uncertainty is turned into ritual. People arrive with symptoms, stories, and fears. They leave with packages, instructions, and the feeling that at least someone in town has looked them in the eye and said there may be a workable answer. That social role made the soda fountain more than an accessory. It became the bright, polished heart of the room. Young men took stools there, partly for the drink, and partly for the chance to linger where they might be seen lingering. Girls with gloves and careful hair might accept a glass in full view of propriety, and still feel the pleasant thrill of participating in something modern. Children looked at the fountain with almost religious awe, because anything that hissed, shone, foamed, and ended in sweetness was bound to seem miraculous. Tired adults let the sound of the carbonated water reassure them that modern life, however unsettling, was at least trying to provide cleaner pleasures than mud, whiskey, and despair. The fountain itself deserves a slower description. There are silver taps and levers. There are thick glasses waiting in rows. There are syrup bottles lined up like organ pipes, in colors that promise a whole mechanical garden of flavor. Cherry, vanilla, sassafras, lemon, phosphates, exotic names, scientific names, friendly names. The counter is marble because marble cools, and coolness in an Atlanta summer is nearly a moral good. Behind the fountain, the soda jerk moves quickly enough to look gifted and slowly enough to remain elegant. He pours with a confidence that suggests youth, when youth has been granted a small kingdom of fizz. When Coca-Cola enters this world, it does not replace everything at once. It joins the orchestra and then slowly takes over the melody. One customer orders it because he has heard it helps with fatigue. Another because she likes that it tastes less medicinal than the others. Another because the very name sounds modern and foreign enough to suggest that something new is taking shape in the city. Another orders it because the person beside him just smiled after the first sip in a way he has not managed all week. The spread of a drink is often social before it is analytical. People notice one another's pleasure and call that proof. This is why a soda fountain can become more powerful than a doctor's pamphlet. It is immediate, it is visible, it is shareable. One can watch a stranger brighten. One can hear the praise while the cold remains in the glass. One can become curious in real time, and because the setting is public, the pleasure looks safer than private vice, cleaner than the saloon, and gentler than the little bottles hidden away in bedside tables and kitchen cabinets. Another room is the back room where Pemberton and others like him keep experimenting. The public likes to imagine inventions as sparks, but most inventions are repetitions. Another batch, another spoon, another note in the ledger, another attempt to make the herbal bitterness less punishing and the stimulating effect more dependable. The room is often warm from lamps, from cooking syrup, from being too crowded with hopeful objects. Essential oils sit stoppered in small glass, Sugar weights in heavy sacks, leaves and nuts and extracts represent miles and oceans and trade routes the customer never sees. A smell of caramel begins to creep over the sharper medicinal notes. That smell matters because the nose often decides before the tongue does whether something belongs to medicine or to indulgence. Pemberton stands over the table, not as a magician, but as a patient rearranger of promises. He wants the drink to help. He wants the drink to sell. He wants the drink not to remind the public too strongly of bitterness, illness, war wounds, dependence, or old fatigue. There is something profoundly American in that desire. If relief must come from chemistry, let chemistry at least be charming. Some batches fail by being too thin, others by being too harsh. One can imagine the discouragement of tasting a syrup that contains all the right intentions and none of the right pleasure. The notebook requires small disappointments, more sugar next time, less of this extract, a brighter finish, a cleaner aroma, a little more spice, or perhaps less invention. When seen closely, is almost embarrassingly domestic in its repeated negotiations with proportion. And sometimes the room itself participates. A temperature changes the result. A delay changes the texture. A distraction alters the ratio. A supplier sends leaves of slightly different quality. The water behaves differently. The sugar is cooked a little farther. These are not only accidents, they are the way material reality insists on helping decide what history will later call a formula. The world enters the bottle, even before the bottle enters the room. The third room is the doctor's office, which deserves more time than it usually receives in the simpler retellings. The doctor's office is quieter than the soda fountain and less visually charming than the drugstore, but it possesses something stronger than charm. It possesses authority. The patient sits in a chair and says what can be said without saying too much. Tired, low, nervous, not sleeping, easily exhausted, run down. The language is careful because the era has limited patience for emotional complexity in ordinary people. Symptoms are easier to manage than entire lives. The doctor asks questions, perhaps with genuine sympathy, perhaps with practiced efficiency, perhaps with a little of both. He knows the patient wants an answer. He knows the patient must return to the day. He knows, too, that the whole structure of modernizing urban and domestic life has begun to produce new forms of strain that medicine is only partly prepared to understand. In such an atmosphere, a stimulant can be framed as kindness. A recommendation for Coca-Cola, or for a related tonic, is not necessarily cynical. That is part of the unsettling tenderness of this period. Many physicians believed they were assisting people toward function, cheer, and steadiness. The trouble is that the culture around them increasingly rewarded function so much that it forgot to ask whether the patient needed rest, relief from expectation, or simply less to carry. So the patient leaves the doctor's office carrying legitimacy in verbal form, and that legitimacy is redeemed at the pharmacy counter. The fourth room is the family home. This is where the drink begins to change again, because anything brought into the home begins taking on the meanings of habit, hospitality, and daily life. A bottle set in a wash basin of cool water for later. Crate kept in a pantry or back room. A glass poured on a porch in the evening. A child allowed a little, if company is over. A husband arriving hot from work and feeling for the cork. A mother setting out bottles for guests and enjoying, perhaps, that she can offer something lively without offering alcohol. The home absorbs the drink into its rituals, and once that happens, the old pharmacy aura becomes only one ancestor among several. Picture a summer porch now. The boards are worn from the day. The air is thick with insects and fading light. Someone has brought out bottles from the coolest place in the house. The cork comes free, with a quick, satisfying sound. The glass sweats in the hand. The first swallow cuts through the heat with a little violence and a lot of relief. Conversation begins to feel less effortful. The evening, which might otherwise have sagged under humidity and ordinary fatigue, lifts slightly. Children are told not to drink too fast, and Aunt remarks that it is the only thing worth keeping on ice. A cousin says she heard the mayor keeps a case at all times. Somebody laughs. Somebody wants another bottle. In this way empires are built. Not only in offices and factories, but on porches. One pleasant repetition at a time. Another family room is the church social or the picnic ground, where Coca-Cola becomes proof that pleasure need not wear a guilty face. Tables are laid with cakes, pies, lemonade, cold meats, biscuits, and the respectable abundance of a gathering that wants to feel festive without looking reckless. Here, the temperance triumph reveals its secret compromise. The old fear of whiskey remains. The old suspicion of saloons remains. But people still want refreshment, brightness, a shared little luxury. Bottled soda enters this gap and looks positively wholesome next to a flask. Mothers approve because it is sold in daylight and in stores with shelves of medicine, rather than in rooms with swinging doors. Ministers approve because one can still quote morality while taking a second helping of fizz. Young people approve because any social ritual involving sweetness and repeat visits to the table will eventually generate its own flirtations. And so, by trying to strip the nation of one kind of stimulant culture, reform helped create room for another. This deserves its own quiet Sunday scene. The sermon is over, hats are adjusted, hands are shaken. The church doors open onto heat and dust and bright after-service conversation. Somewhere nearby, bottles have been cooling. The labels catch the light. A father who would never bring beer to this gathering accepts a Coca-Cola without hesitation. A woman who would blush to be seen entering a saloon lifts the bottle quite calmly. A deacon discusses municipal improvements with a drink in hand that owes part of its popularity to the moral campaign he has spent years supporting. Nobody sees contradiction because contradiction has been carefully packaged as refreshment. A fifth room is the bottling plant, and here the story acquires a new sound. The pharmacy had clinks and hisses and spoons. The bottling plant has rattles, crates, cappers, shouted instructions, the scrape of wood, the ring of glass, and the weary patience of workers handling something fragile at speed. Bottling is where an idea becomes logistics. The drink must be consistent enough to survive distance and standard enough to remain recognizable even after travel. Every bottle is not only a drink, but a carrier of trust. If the cork fails, the trust fails a little. If the fizz dies, the magic thins. If the label peels or the syrup turns, the modern dream looks shabby. There's romance in the bottle now, but romance requires labor. Men lift crates. Women may label or inspect, depending on the place and the moment. Someone wipes down a spill that has made the boards treacherous. Someone curses softly at a bad cork. Someone checks a shipment list. Outside, wagons wait. Later, there will be trains. The bottle wants motion. Motion is expensive. Motion breaks things. Motion also makes myths possible. When the crates begin traveling, the drink takes on new geographies. Small towns hear of it before they see it. A shipment arrives, and the grocer stacks the bottles in the window. Children press close. Men who pride themselves on skepticism buy one anyway. Women buy them for guests because the label itself now carries social value. To be able to offer what the city offers is to participate in a broader American present. This is another kind of intoxication, softer than chemistry, and perhaps just as enduring, the intoxication of not being left behind. A sixth room is the train depot. Heat, dust, waiting. A porter carrying luggage. A station, clock, a boy selling papers, and in the middle of all that travel weariness, the possibility of a cold bottled drink. Coca-Cola at a depot is not only refreshment, it is continuity. A traveler who has learned to trust the bottle in one town can trust it in another. Brand loyalty, in its earliest emotional sense, is simply the comfort of finding a familiar answer in an unfamiliar place. Drink it there, and the future tastes portable. A seventh room is the dentist's office, which becomes busier than anyone originally intended. Sugar's bill always arrives after the party. In the beginning, the public notices mostly the immediate pleasures, the sweetness, the lift, the ritual, the sociability. Teeth complain more slowly, they ache at odd hours. A jaw grows tender, a tooth begins to throb when something cold touches it. Another chips. The era's dental remedies are not gentle enough to improve the drink's reputation by association. Yet, for a time, the bottle's pleasures still outrun the mouth's objections. Human beings are very patient with future discomfort, when present delight comes chilled and sparkling. The dentist sees the pattern before the public wants to describe it as a pattern. More cavities, more extractions, more anxious patients in hard chairs under harsh instruments. The same century that praised stimulation in medicine, progress in bottling, and sweetness in everyday life was not especially good at balancing those joys against the slower record kept by enamel. One can almost hear the private joke in town. The soda fountain and the dentist are in business together, even if no contract has been signed. A different kind of bill arrives in the nerves. Too much in the afternoon, too much too often, too much for those already inclined towards sleeplessness or overbrightness. Not every customer experiences the same result, but enough do that stories begin gathering into a shape. A cousin awake too late, a worker suddenly over-talkative, a child still chattering at bedtime, a woman saying her heart felt odd after a second glass. These are not yet the language of full public alarm. They are the language of experience becoming harder to ignore. And still the bottle remains on the table, because the bottle by now is no longer only chemistry. It is comfort, it is company, it is a known pleasure, it is one of the small rewards by which the day is divided into manageable parts. That is what makes reform so difficult whenever a product has succeeded too well. People do not defend only ingredients, they defend habits, hospitality, memories, and the little bright structure of everyday life. This is why the eventual panic has to be understood as both moral and intimate. Newspapers help spread it, of course. Newspapers love a question with a stimulant hiding inside it. Is there a drug in your daily drink? Are soda fountains more potent than they appear? Is the nation consuming a chemical enthusiasm under the cover of family respectability? The headlines sharpen, reformers gather, medical language shifts. What once sounded progressive begins, in some ears, to sound reckless. Yet the ordinary scenes continue underneath the headlines. A man still buys a bottle on his way home. A family still sets one out for supper. A church social still serves it. A pharmacist still arranges syrup bottles in the same old order. A mother still thinks of it as something nicer than plain water and less morally troublesome than drink. Public panic rarely moves at the same speed as private habit. And so the company's problem is not merely scientific. It is emotional. Remove the cocaine too loudly, and the public may feel betrayed. Remove it too awkwardly, and the drink may lose the aura that helped build it. Remove it too slowly, and the reformers may grow louder. The solution, as with so many commercial transitions, is to let the object remain familiar while the chemistry grows less so. There is a tenderness in that maneuver too, because it recognizes how deeply people had attached themselves to more than a formula. They had attached themselves to the counter, the bottle, the sound, the refreshment, the porch, the train platform, the little bit of brightness before work, the little bit of company after church, the soft relief of having a drink everyone could accept in public. Coca-Cola's true power was not merely that it stimulated. It taught the country how to build a respectable ritual around stimulation, and rituals survive ingredient changes better than one might expect. So the formula shifts quietly, the language shifts quietly, the mythology remains, and over time, as happens with many very successful products, the public memory trims away the most awkward sections of the origin story and leaves behind a cleaner line from invention to icon. But the awkward sections do not vanish. They settle like sediment in the bottle's ancestry. They wait for someone to hold the modern object up to the light and ask what once lived beneath the sweetness. That is what we are doing tonight. We are not accusing the glass. We are not defending it either. We are only letting it remember. Let it remember the workable and the wound. Let it remember the pharmacy bench. Let it remember the soda jerk's careful hand. Let it remember the church social and the temperance hymn and the polite bottle passed from hand to hand as if loopholes were a sacrament. Let it remember the train depot, the porch, the dentist, the newspapers, the chemists in the back room trying to keep the spell while changing the substance. Let it remember that modernity in America has often tasted sweetest where medicine, commerce, and desire briefly agreed to call one another by nicer names. Now let the pace slow again. The pharmacy is closing. One last customer leaves. The bell over the door gives a soft, brief ring and then is still. The glasses have been rinsed. The marble counter has been wiped down. Syrup bottles stand in rows, their colors darkening as the light fades. Somewhere toward the back, a ledger is shut. A stool is nudged under the counter. Outside, the city loosens into evening. A horse passes. A wagon rattles farther away. The day's heat lifts from the street in a slow, invisible breath. This is the safe part of the story again. The room is quiet. The bottles are quiet. The old claims on the labels are quiet. Even the drink itself, for the moment, is quiet. Nothing bubbles forever. And because endings matter in sleep stories, let us come all the way back to the present without hurrying. There is a bottle now in a modern room, or a can, or perhaps only the memory of one. It sits on a table under electric light in a world of ingredient laws. Filtered water, refrigeration, supply chains, and public knowledge so broad that it can make the past feel simultaneously absurd and intimate. The label is familiar. The shape is familiar. The act of opening it is almost too ordinary to deserve narrative attention. And yet the object carries all of that older room inside it, if one listens carefully enough. The pharmacy, the gaslight, the hurt body of Pemberton, the coca leaves and cola nuts waiting on a workable, the spoon in the syrup, the first cold glass, the fountain as a family-safe thrill, the temperance movement, accidentally redirecting the nation's thirst, the doctor's recommendation, the clink of bottles in crates, the too sweet mouth, the restless sleep, the careful reform, the strange American talent for turning a chemically complicated past into a clean present-day brand. Ordinary things often have the strangest ancestors. That may be the softest and most useful final thought in the whole story. Not that Coca-Cola was once scandalous, though it was. Not that America was reckless, though often it was. Not even that people were naive, though every era has its special blindness. The gentler truth is that people wanted relief, stimulation, company, and a better afternoon. And in one specific place and time, a drink managed to promise all of those things at once, while wearing the smile of medicine and the manners of respectability. The room is darker now. The old Atlanta street has faded. The pharmacy shelves are only shapes. The syrup bottle catches one last gleam, and then gives it up. The marble counter cools into memory, somewhere far away. If you listen in the right way, you can almost hear the little hiss of soda water meeting syrup, and the small delighted intake of breath before the first sip. Then even that sound grows softer. The counter disappears. The bottle rests. The fizz settles. And if your own mind is still wandering through that old drugstore, let it wander more slowly now. Let it pass the bench by the wall, the bell over the door, the bottle labels, the little brass taps, the polished glass, the folded prescription, the ledger in the back room, the dusty street outside, the warm city air, the crate of bottles waiting near the entrance, the last reflections on the marble, until all of it grows quieter and quieter, and finally drifts out of focus. The room is calm now, the glass is still, and history, which meant so much of this story rising in bubbles, has at last gone soft and dark and nearly silent beneath the surface.